One thing is certain, if you quilt, you likely end up with a lot of scraps. I have scraps of fabric all over my quilting room. I try to sort them and even cut them down into usable squares, but they kind of still get out of hand. For a while, I was really good at cutting a lot of my smaller scraps into 2-inch squares, but as you can see, they're just piling up too, and I haven't used them. So in deciding how to use them, I came up with a Scrap Magic quilt pattern. Why am I calling it Scrap Magic? Well, because I don't just have small pieces of scrap, I have larger pieces of scraps to use as well. Like, sometimes I'll end up with big pieces of fabric left over, and I don't really want to cut this down into 2-inch squares. So this pattern is going to use 4 different sizes of scraps to help you use up a lot more variety of your scrap pieces you may have. So this quilt pattern has 2 different blocks in it. The first block will use up your 2-inch squares and 2.5-inch squares. And the next block will use up 3.5 and 4-inch squares. So gather up your scraps and come join me. Let's make a scrappy quilt together. So the first thing I do is gather up the scraps that I want to use in this quilt. You're going to want some lighter background fabric and then some fabric that has some color and print to it. Once I gather some scraps that I want to use, I just start cutting them down to size. So since this is a larger piece of fabric here, I'm going to cut some of my larger squares from it first. I'm going to use a trim lock to cut mine. This is a 4-inch trim lock, which is one of the sizes that I need. And I'm just going to cut around it and get some of the size squares that I need. Really just make some quick work of it, but you can also use your regular quilting ruler, or if you have an AccuQuilt with the proper size dies, you could use that as well. That will also make quick work of getting your fabric cut to size. So for the first block we are going to need 16 2-inch squares that are a background light fabric color. Then you're going to need 16 2.5-inch squares that are also that light fabric color. I'm using a mixture of tone-on-tone white prints and light creams, but you could use any color you wanted. It doesn't necessarily have to be light. You'll just want some contrast between that and the fabrics you're using to make up the diamonds. Then you're going to also need 16 2-inch squares that are print fabric and 16 2.5-inch squares that are print fabric as well. That is a lot of numbers to throw at you for one block, so I'll put all those down in the description of the video as well so you can refer to it when making this quilt. So I'm just going to get a few more pieces cut from this fabric and then we'll start on the block. So once you get all the fabric cut that you need for your block, the only prep work we're going to have to do is making the half square triangles for the block. And I like to make half square triangles 2 at a time. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So I'm going to take one of the 2.5-inch light background fabric and I'm going to draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of it. So I have the line drawn corner to corner, and along with this light background fabric we're also going to need a 2.5-inch print fabric. So I'm going to place these right sides together. I'm going to lay them right together, make sure they're lined up really nice. And if you need to, you could place some pins in this to make sure it doesn't shift around. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sew along each side of that drawn line 1/4 inch away. I honestly usually sew a scant 1/4 inch away just to give myself some wiggle room to make sure I can trim this down to a perfect half square triangle. So once you get that line of stitches along one side of that line, you're going to turn and do a line of stitches along the other side. All right, so once I get both lines of stitches sewn, I like to give the block a quick press just to make sure it's laying nice and flat. All right, so I gave it a quick press and now we are going to cut right along that line we drew. All right, so we're gonna cut right along that drawn line, and then this will give us 2 half square triangles. So I'm gonna press the seam for both of these. And I'm actually going to give them a little bit of a finger press first just to get it moving in the right direction. And this helps make sure I don't get a wonky press on it where it's not quite pressed even at the seam. All right, now that I press them both with heat, I can trim these down to 2-inch squares. So I'm going to use a 2-inch trim lock to make quick trimming of this square. You could also just use whatever ruler you have to trim these up to 2-inch squares. Use whatever method you prefer. All right, so there is one of my 2-inch half square triangles. And then I'm trimming up the next. All right, so that just makes quick work of trimming it. There is a diagonal line that I line up on the seam and it just trims it perfectly to a 2-inch half square triangle. And then you'll just need to repeat that to make 32 of these cute little half square triangles that will help make up this block. So this block is made up of 4 smaller blocks. At least that is how I start sewing this block together. It just makes it easier for me. Once I get all my half square triangles prepped and all of the fabric I need for this block prepped, I like to lay them out on design boards to sew it together. It just makes it a lot easier for me. And I make sure I have enough for 4 of these smaller squares so I can sew that block together. So here is what I have all laid out to sew together. So I'll show you how to sew one of these together. And then you'll just do that 3 more times to bring this block together. So I like to sew this together by row. It just makes it easier for me. There's a lot of different ways you could do this, of course. Sew it together for what works for your brain and to keep everything organized. There's not one way to do literally anything. At least when it comes to something like this, right? So I press the seam with my fingers as I go and just make sure however you feel like pressing your seams in this first row to press the next row seams in the opposite direction so the seams can nest together. So I'm going to sew on the next square in the row. A lot of the time I would nest something like this together, but for me when I was trying to do that, I was worried about getting everything mixed up on this block, and after I took the time to lay it out, I didn't want to mess it all up, and these are such small little squares. I find it harder to keep track of the seams when they're nested and which way to press them. So I just really preferred sewing it a row at a time. So I have that first row sewn together and I have the seams finger pressed, but now I'm going to press them with heat. All right, so now that I pressed it with the iron, I have the seams laying nice and flat, and I just lay this where I can see it and start working on the next row. And the reason I lay it where I can see it is so that I can press the seams in opposite directions for the next row. And I keep doing it the same way for each block. So I don't press this row, the first row in this block one way, and then when I get to the second block, I don't press it a different way. I keep pressing them the same way so that they'll all come together later. So I'm going to finger press the seams, and I'm looking at that first row to make sure I'm pressing the seams in opposite directions to that one. All right, so I have that row all pressed with heat so everything's laying nice and flat, and then I just go ahead and bring the first and second row together. And since they're pressed in opposite directions at the seams, they just fit together really nicely. You can feel that there's not a lot of bulk there since the seams are going in opposite directions. So I can just sew across there nicely. If you want to, put some pins in to make sure everything stays nice and lined up. But for me, this is a scrappy quilt, so I'm okay if it's off a little bit. Adds more fun and a little bit of funkiness to the quilt if it's not perfect. I feel that way about all my quilts though. I just need them to be perfect-ish. Just be close to perfect and we're fine. All right, so I'm gonna press this seam with some heat and then work on the third row. All right, so I'm taking the first and second squares in that third row, placing them right sides together and sewing a 1/4 inch seam across there. And then I'm just gonna finger press it in the opposite direction of that seam on the second row and just keep working across here. I honestly feel like working this way and working one block at a time is just a little more fun and relaxing for me. I don't feel like I'm trying to rush through making the quilt. I'm just having fun with it, using whatever scraps I grab at the time and sewing that something together. Not worrying about, oh, does this go with this? Does this block have too much of one color in it? It's a scrappy quilt. I'm just gonna have fun with it. Now, do I think if you made this quilt and did really look at all the colors and make sure everything goes together perfectly, if that'll be a lot of fun too? Of course. It just depends on what type of quilt you're wanting to make in that moment. I think it'd be really fun if you did one block with a lot of different pinks and one block with a lot of different purples and kind of made a rainbow quilt of these blocks. There's a lot of fun things you could do with this idea. But sometimes after especially a really intricate quilt with a lot of small cuts and a lot of details and you know, one that's more advanced, it's fun to do something just freeing like this where you're just having fun with it. All right, so I have that one pressed and I'm just gonna put it together with the first 2 rows there and make sure the seams are lining up nicely and sew across there. Right, I'm just making sure that we're pressing these in the same direction. Finger press that, and then I'm gonna press it with some heat. Let's work on the last row here. It really is some very simple sewing here. There's nothing complicated about it at all. It's just, I think, a lot of fun. I personally like making half square triangles. I know this is a lot of half square triangles and they're small, but I think with this method where you're intentionally going to trim it down, I was pressing that the wrong way. I need to pay attention. when you're intentionally going to trim it down to size, I think it makes the half square triangles a little more fun. I have never been able to sew a half square triangle perfectly to size. Mine would always get wonky. So I intentionally sew mine a little bit larger than they need to be and trim them down to the perfect size. That just works better for me. All right, and then we're gonna sew the third row on. And press that seam. All right, and then one of the 4 blocks is done. I really don't think it takes too much time, especially for these small pieces. It's really some very easy sewing here. So I'm gonna get the other 3 sewn so we can bring this first block together. All right, we're just finishing up the final row on the final little block here. So this last row on. All right, and now that we have all 4 of these, we can bring together our larger block. And that's just bringing together the 4 of these little diamond blocks. So you can lay them out in different ways, see how you like them. I already had mine laid out the way I intended to sew them together, so I'm just gonna sew the first 2 together. And honestly, when you're making it this scrappy intentionally, does it really matter to fret over which way they go together? You can. You can always do it whichever way you prefer. All right, so I'm going to press that seam. All right, and then we're going to sew the next 2 together. Now I'm going to press the seam in the opposite direction to the row above it. All right, and just bring those 2 together. And if you made sure to press all the seams going in opposite directions, this should come together really easily. All the seams should be nested. Do a final press on this last seam. And there you go. There is block 1. How cute is that? Using up all those scraps. And the fun thing is that when you look at this quilt after, you're going to see all these fabrics in it that you're going to remember from past quilts you made, and that just makes it so much fun to me. Cute, cute, cute block. All right, so this block measures in at about 12.5 inches unfinished. So think about that. If you want to make a larger quilt, the block should finish at about 12 inches. So it should let you know how many blocks you'll need to make the size quilt that you want. So you could keep making this block over and over and make a really great quilt. But I'm going to show you block 2 because I think it's a lot of fun to alternate the sizes of this block to give a little bit more interest to this already fun and wacky scrap magic quilt. Plus, it'll use up some of your other fabric scraps that are a little bit larger too, so you don't have to cut them down too small. And this block comes together really, really fast, especially compared to this one with the smaller pieces. All right, so for block 2, you're going to need 4 3.5-inch light fabric squares. And then you're going to need 4-inch light fabric squares. You're going to use those to make the half square triangles again. And then you're going to need 4 print 3.5-inch squares and 4 print 4-inch squares for the half square triangles again. Now, I usually make this block 2 at a time because if you make the half square triangles with this block, you're going to get 2 of the same print, and that'll be a lot for one block like this, right? So I usually make 2 of these blocks at a time. Now again, the first step to making this block is to prep the half square triangles once you get all of that fabric cut. So I have my light fabric here, and on the back of it, I'm going to draw a line again, corner to corner. Now, once that line is drawn, I'm going to place it right sides together onto a corresponding 4-inch print fabric. Make sure it's lined up nicely, and then sew a 1/4 inch away from that drawn line. I usually make sure to do a scant 1/4 inch just so I have wiggle room to trim this up to size. So I sewed along one side of the line. I'm going to turn it and sew along the other side. All right, and I'm going to press this before cutting just to make sure it lays nice and flat. You can see it kind of gets some bunching along there whenever you sew. So there you go, it's laying nice and flat now. So I'm going to cut right along that drawn line. So cut this in half. And then again, we'll have 2 half square triangles. I'm going to finger press that first. And then after finger pressing those half square triangles, I press them with some heat. What is your biggest struggle with scraps? Do you have a hard time bringing a quilt together using so many different fabrics and colors? Do you have trouble organizing them? What is the biggest obstacle you have with your scraps? For me, it's really hard for me to use them all up. I make so many quilts, so I end up with so many different scraps and so many different fabrics. I keep having big goals to get them organized, and honestly, I'll start it and I don't keep up with it, so I just need to use them. All right, so I have these pressed, and now I'm going to trim them down to 3.5-inch half square triangles. All right, so I have the 3.5-inch trim lock here. I have the diagonal line lined up on it, so I'm just going to trim around all edges. So I have one all trimmed up. I love half square triangles. They're so versatile. You can make so many different designs with just the half square triangle. All right, so now I have 2 half square triangles, and I can use these to start laying out my block to sew together. So again, this is how the block will look. It's just an oversized version of one of those 4 blocks we had in block 1, and this one comes together so fast. Again, you could just make this block over and over again if you wanted to. I just really think it looks a lot of fun with those smaller ones as well. All right, so here I have some fabric all cut up, and I have half square triangles made to sew together this block too. So let's bring this one together. All right, so it's really so easy. We're just following those same steps as before, but just on a larger scale. So I'm going to sew together the first row of fabrics. I really, on this one, like working a row at a time. I don't know, there's just something so relaxing about just being able to sit and sew, not worried about making, you know, nets of chain piecing the block together. Just, you know, sew a seam, press it, sew the next block on in a row, and just have a calm sewing session. But if you want to chain piece them, make a net out of this block, do that. Do what makes you happy in the moment. It's your quilt after all, right? All right, I'm finger pressing the seams. I'm going to tell you a little secret. On the last block that I sewed, I realized one of my light fabrics I sewed on with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, and I just left it. It is this fabric that I'm sewing right now, and I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it has a really tan floral design on it, and it's really, really cute. I love this fabric. I had a lot of it left over from one of my last projects, but without my glasses on, my eyesight is not great, and I didn't even notice that I sewed it on until I was looking at the back and making sure a seam was fine, and then I could see that the actual print was on this side. You really can't notice that much because since it's so light, on the wrong side it just kind of looks like a light colored fabric, so I left it. All right, so I have that first row sewn. I don't have enough space up here to leave it up here while I sew the next rows, but I'm going to leave it close at hand so I can make sure I'm pressing the seams in opposite directions. At this point, pretty comfortable that I remember with each row which direction they get pressed, but just in case, I like to keep that row handy so I can double check myself. I mean, I just sewed the wrong side of fabric facing up, so I don't want to, you know, get ahead of myself thinking I know exactly what I'm doing. This block just comes together so fast. And once it's finished, it's going to be the same size as the other block, about 12.5 inches square. If you need to trim it up to size to make sure it's nice and even, go ahead and do that. All right, so I have that row done, and I'm going to press the seams again really well. All right, so that row is nice and pressed flat, and I'm going to go ahead now and add it on to the first row. I just like building the block and seeing it come together. This would be a fun quilt to do, like, as you gather scraps together, make, you know, a block or two at a time, and then get a quilt made. That'd kind of be like a goal I would like to have, and maybe not just do this quilt over and over, but other scrap quilts that I like. But that's always a lofty goal, right? To keep up with your scraps, to get some process, make a quilt block at a time. I always think it would be fun to do something like that, and then I have trouble following through though. All right, so we have the first 2 rows, and there's only 4 rows in this block. All right, so we're working on row 3. All right, so row 3 is sewn, and I have finger pressed them, so I'm going to press those with the iron. Then we'll sew row 3 on. If I can line it up, we'll sew it on. All right, so I'm getting it lined up. I can feel all those seams meeting together nicely. Press that seam. All right, and then we're going to work on the last row, row 3 here. All right, so the final row is getting sewn on, and you can see this block all finished. All right, let's press that last seam on this block. All right, and so there is block 2. So I really think this Scrap Magic quilt will be a lot of fun for you to sew together. Use up various sizes of your scraps and don't leave them just laying around getting unused. All right, so look at those two different sizes of blocks coming together. I think it looks a lot of fun. I'll sew a few more of these together and then I'll put how it looks up on the screen here so you can see a few more of the blocks together, and then I'll show you with just the large blocks and with just the small blocks so you can decide which layout design would work best for you. I hope you have fun putting the Scrap Magic quilt pattern together. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.